Albert Camus believed that revolution is one of the most dangerous ideas in human history, not because it begins with evil, but because it often begins with justice. Revolutions are born from real suffering. They emerge when people can no longer tolerate oppression, poverty, or humiliation. In that sense, Camus understood the revolutionary impulse deeply. He did not condemn the desire to change the world. He feared what happens when that desire loses its moral limits. Camus had watched revolutions promise freedom and deliver terror. He saw movements that began by demanding dignity end by building prisons. He saw ideals of equality transform into systems of execution. This pattern convinced him that revolution, if it does not restrain itself, will always turn against the very people it claims to liberate. For Camus, the danger of revolution lies in its relationship to time. Revolutions are obsessed with the future. They promise a world that does not yet exist, a perfect society that will be born after the old one is destroyed. This future becomes so powerful that it justifies everything done in its name. Suffering today is accepted because paradise is supposed to arrive tomorrow. Camus rejected this logic completely. He believed no future has the right to cancel out present human lives. A political movement that sacrifices living people for an imagined tomorrow has already betrayed justice. This is why Camus insisted that rebellion must not become revolution. Rebellion for him begins when someone says, "This is intolerable." It is a refusal to accept humiliation or cruelty. But rebellion remains connected to the present. It wants change now, without destroying the people who exist now. Revolution, by contrast, tries to impose a final answer on history. It seeks to create a perfect order. In doing so, it demands absolute loyalty and eliminates those who stand in the way. This is how it becomes violent. Camus believed that a just society cannot be built through murder. A world created by terror will always be haunted by terror. Violence does not disappear when a revolution succeeds. It becomes part of the system. For Camus, the tragedy of revolution is that it mistakes destruction for creation. It believes that tearing down the old world will automatically produce a better one. History, he believed, shows the opposite. Camus believed that revolutions fail because they forget why they began. They start as protests against injustice, but they end as systems of power. Once a movement takes control, it becomes more concerned with preserving itself than with protecting the people who suffered in the first place. This transformation is almost inevitable. Power attracts fear. Fear demands control. Control requires force. Camus saw this pattern in every modern revolution. Leaders who once spoke of liberation became administrators of repression. Prisons replaced palaces. Secret police replaced kings. The symbols changed, but the logic remained the same. What begins as rebellion becomes domination. Camus believed this happens because revolution tries to replace one absolute with another. It destroys the old authority only to install a new one. In doing so, it repeats the same injustice in a different form. True justice, Camus believed, cannot be built on absolutes. It must be built on limits. A society must know what it will not do, even in the pursuit of good. Revolutionary movements, however, tend to believe they are beyond limits. Their cause feels so righteous that nothing seems forbidden. Once this happens, violence becomes a moral duty. Camus believed that when a movement says everything is permitted, it has already abandoned justice. This is why he argued that rebellion must remain unfinished. It must never seek to become total power. It must always be willing to resist itself. Rebellion says, this injustice must end. Revolution says, we must control everything so injustice never returns. The first preserves freedom, the second destroys it. Camus chose rebellion. Camus believed that revolution becomes deadly when it claims to act in the name of history. Revolutionary movements often believe they are the voice of historical necessity. They see themselves as instruments of progress, carrying humanity toward its inevitable destiny. Anyone who resists is not just wrong, they are standing in the way of history itself. This belief is catastrophic. When people think history is on their side, they stop listening to living human beings. They become deaf to suffering. They believe that whatever they do will eventually be justified by the future. Camus rejected this idea entirely. History does not have a voice. It does not judge. It does not forgive. Only people do. To claim that history demands violence is to escape responsibility. It allows people to say, "I had no choice." Camus believed this was one of the most dangerous lies in politics. There is always a choice. Even in extreme circumstances, people choose how far they are willing to go. Revolutionary terror is built on the denial of this truth. It pretends that cruelty is necessary. It pretends that killing is unavoidable. But for Camus, necessity is a moral invention. It is what people call their own decisions when they do not want to face them. Camus believed that no cause is so important that it removes personal responsibility. You cannot hand your conscience over to history. This is why Camus insisted that every act of violence must be judged in the present, not excused by the future. If something is wrong today, it will still be wrong tomorrow. Revolutions promise a better world. But Camus believed that a better world cannot be built on crimes. Camus believed that revolution becomes especially dangerous when it begins to treat human beings as symbols rather than individuals. In revolutionary thinking, people are often reduced to categories: oppressors, traitors, bourgeois, enemies of the people. Once someone is assigned a label, their individual story disappears. This makes killing easier. When you no longer see a person, you no longer feel their suffering. You feel only the righteousness of your cause. Camus believed this was how revolutions slide into mass violence. Justice, by contrast, requires that we never stop seeing individuals. Even someone who has committed terrible acts remains a human being with a face, a history, and a life. To erase that individuality is to abandon morality. Camus believed that revolution erases individuality because it needs enemies. To maintain its momentum, it must always have someone to fight. And once external enemies are gone, it creates internal ones. This is how revolutions devour their own children. Camus saw this clearly in the purges of revolutionary regimes. Former allies became traitors. Loyal supporters became suspects. The logic of suspicion never ends once it begins. Revolution claims to liberate humanity. But in practice, it often creates a society of fear. For Camus, this was the ultimate tragedy. A movement that began by opposing oppression becomes oppressive itself. This is why Camus believed that rebellion must always be personal. It must remain rooted in concrete suffering and specific injustices. Once it becomes abstract, it becomes dangerous. Revolution wants to reshape the whole world. Rebellion wants to stop a particular cruelty. Camus trusted the second far more than the first. Camus believed that revolutions are driven by a deep desire for moral purity. Revolutionary movements often speak of cleansing society of corruption, injustice, or evil. They promise to remove everything that stands in the way of a new, better world. This language is seductive, but it is also deadly. When a society begins to think in terms of purity, it begins to think in terms of elimination. Camus rejected this way of thinking entirely. No society is pure. No human being is pure. To demand purity is to prepare for cruelty. Revolutions often start by attacking unjust institutions, but they end by attacking people. Those who do not fit the new moral ideal become enemies. Dissent becomes contamination. Camus believed this is how revolutions justify terror. They convince themselves that killing is not just acceptable, but necessary to protect the revolution from corruption. But violence does not protect justice. It poisons it. Camus argued that when a movement claims it must kill to survive, it has already become morally bankrupt. True justice does not need to murder its critics. Revolutionary regimes often speak of temporary violence. They claim that repression will end once the new order is established. History shows that it never does. Once a system learns to rule through fear, it cannot stop. Camus believed that the desire for purity always leads to tyranny. A just society is not a pure one. It is a society that knows how to live with difference, disagreement, and imperfection without resorting to violence. This is why Camus opposed revolutions that tried to remake humanity. He believed humanity does not need to be remade. It needs to be protected. Camus believed that revolution becomes especially dangerous when it starts to confuse justice with victory. Revolutionary movements often begin by demanding fairness, dignity, and freedom. But once they are locked in a struggle for power, winning becomes more important than being right. The cause shifts from justice to domination. When this happens, violence is no longer a tragic necessity. It becomes a strategy. Camus saw this in both right-wing and left-wing revolutions. Each side claimed to be fighting for the people. Each justified terror as a way to secure its triumph. In both cases, the lives of ordinary human beings were treated as expendable. Camus believed this revealed a terrible truth. When justice becomes a competition, it disappears. If the goal is to defeat the enemy at all costs, then no moral limit remains. Everything becomes permitted. This is why Camus insisted that a just rebellion must always accept limits, even if that means it cannot win. Better to remain morally faithful and lose than to triumph through murder. Revolutions hate this idea. They want total victory. They want history to belong to them. But Camus believed that history is not worth owning if it is bought with blood. A society built on terror may achieve stability, but it will never achieve justice. Fear can control people, but it cannot earn their respect. The silence of obedience is not the same as peace. Camus believed that when revolutions win through violence, they inherit the moral rot of their methods. They cannot build a humane world because they have already destroyed the moral ground on which such a world must stand. This is why Camus argued that means matter more than ends. The way you fight determines the kind of world you create. A movement that kills to achieve justice will produce a society that knows only killing. Camus believed that one of the deepest illusions of revolution is the belief that human nature can be remade through political force. Revolutionary movements often imagine that once unjust systems are destroyed, people themselves will become new, more generous, more equal, more moral. History, Camus believed, shows the opposite. Power does not transform human nature, it reveals it. When revolutions seize control, they must rely on the same tools every state uses: surveillance, policing, punishment, and force. The same human weaknesses, fear, ambition, resentment, reappear inside the new regime. The dream of creating a new humanity collapses under the weight of ordinary psychology. Camus rejected the idea that violence could create virtue. You cannot teach people to respect life by killing. You cannot build trust through terror. You cannot create solidarity through coercion. Revolutionary ideologies often assume that once the old enemies are removed, harmony will follow. But new conflicts always emerge. New hierarchies form. New grievances appear. The world does not become simple just because power has changed hands. Camus believed this was because injustice is not only a matter of institutions, it is also a matter of human limits. Greed, fear, pride, and insecurity do not vanish when a regime falls. They take new forms. This is why Camus opposed revolutions that promise total transformation. They promise more than reality can deliver. When that promise fails, violence returns to enforce it. A just rebellion, by contrast, does not try to remake human beings. It tries to protect them. It does not dream of perfection. It demands decency. Camus believed that the refusal to accept human imperfection is what turns political hope into political terror. When a movement cannot tolerate failure, it turns against those who fail. Revolution in this sense becomes a war against reality. Camus believed that revolutions also fail because they destroy dialogue. In a revolutionary atmosphere, compromise is seen as betrayal. Listening becomes weakness. Every disagreement is treated as an attack. Politics turns into war by other means. This is fatal to justice. A just society must be able to argue without killing. It must allow people to disagree without fear. Revolution, however, demands unity. It needs everyone to move in the same direction. Anyone who hesitates becomes suspect. Camus saw this dynamic in revolutionary tribunals, where trials became performances rather than searches for truth. Verdicts were decided in advance. Confessions were extracted. Guilt was assumed. Justice disappeared. For Camus, this destruction of dialogue was one of the most tragic outcomes of revolution. Once conversation ends, violence begins. He believed that freedom is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to live with it. A free society is one where people can argue, protest, and criticize without being crushed. Revolutions often claim to create freedom, but they eliminate the very conditions that make freedom possible. They replace debate with obedience. Camus believed that justice requires open speech. It requires that even unpopular voices be heard. When a movement silences dissent in the name of the people, it is no longer serving the people. This is why Camus defended democratic values, even though he knew they were imperfect. Democracy allows mistakes to be corrected without bloodshed. Revolution does not. For Camus, the willingness to keep talking, even in conflict, was one of the highest forms of moral maturity. It was the refusal to turn disagreement into death. Camus believed that revolution ultimately becomes a tragedy because it forgets the individual in the name of the collective. Revolutionary movements speak constantly of the people, the masses, or the future. But these words hide a cruel reality. Real human beings are being sacrificed for abstractions. When someone is imprisoned, tortured, or executed in a revolution, it is never the people who suffer. It is a specific person with a body, a family, memories, and fear. Camus insisted that justice must never lose sight of this. Revolutionary thinking often treats individuals as obstacles to be removed rather than lives to be protected. If someone stands in the way of the revolution, they are labeled an enemy. Once that happens, anything done to them becomes permissible. Camus saw this as the moral heart of revolutionary violence. It is not driven by hatred of suffering, but by loyalty to an idea. And ideas, unlike people, do not bleed. This is why Camus insisted that justice must be rooted in the concrete. It must look at the person in front of it, not the theory behind them. A politics that ignores individual suffering has already become inhuman. Revolutions claim to liberate humanity, but they often destroy human beings in the process. That contradiction, Camus believed, is not accidental. It is built into the logic of total change. Total change requires total power. Total power requires total obedience. Total obedience requires terror. Camus refused that chain of reasoning. He believed that a better world cannot be created by breaking people. Any society that demands obedience through fear has already failed. Justice, for Camus, must always be measured in human lives, not historical achievements. A policy that improves statistics but ruins lives is not just. A revolution that creates a new order but leaves behind graves is not a success. Camus believed that the dignity of a single human being outweighs any political victory. That belief put him at odds with every revolutionary movement that demanded sacrifice. But he accepted that cost. He would rather stand with the living than celebrate with the victors. Camus believed that revolution becomes most dangerous when it begins to see violence as not just necessary, but virtuous. At this stage, killing is no longer something to regret. It becomes something to celebrate. Those who die are said to have served the cause. Their deaths are turned into symbols rather than tragedies. This, for Camus, was the final corruption of justice. When death becomes meaningful, it becomes easier to produce. Once a movement teaches people that dying or killing is glorious, it has crossed a line from politics into moral insanity. Life itself becomes cheap. Camus believed that any ideology that glorifies death is fundamentally hostile to humanity. True justice must be rooted in the value of life, not in the romance of sacrifice. Revolutionary movements often create martyrs, but martyrs are always created by killing. And killing, Camus insisted, cannot be made noble by storytelling. He also saw how revolutionary violence hardens those who commit it. People who kill in the name of justice do not remain morally untouched. They become accustomed to cruelty. They begin to see suffering as normal. They lose the ability to feel. This is why Camus believed that even justified violence, if it becomes routine, destroys the soul of a movement. It changes what people are. A revolution that kills to achieve freedom produces people who know only how to kill. It does not create citizens, it creates executioners. Camus believed that a just rebellion must always retain the capacity for shame. It must know when it has gone too far. It must be able to say, "This was wrong." Revolution, by contrast, demands pride. It cannot admit guilt, because guilt would threaten its authority. That is why revolutionary regimes deny their crimes even when the evidence is overwhelming. For Camus, this inability to repent was one of the clearest signs of moral collapse. A movement that cannot regret what it has done has already abandoned justice. Camus believed that the tragedy of revolution is not that it fails, but that when it succeeds, it often becomes the very thing it once opposed. The revolutionaries overthrow tyranny only to become tyrants themselves. They inherit the structures of power they once hated and begin to use them in the same ways. This happens because power does not disappear when it changes hands. It simply finds new masters. Camus believed that revolutions are often blind to this reality. They think that if the right people are in charge, the system will become just. But power always corrupts, because it always tempts people to see others as tools rather than equals. A society built on coercion, surveillance, and punishment cannot produce freedom no matter who controls it. It can only produce obedience. Camus believed that this is why revolutions that succeed politically so often fail morally. They achieve stability, but they lose their soul. He argued that true change does not come from seizing the state, it comes from changing how people treat one another. Institutions matter, but they cannot create dignity on their own. Revolutions promise to remake the world overnight. Camus believed that real justice grows slowly, through limits, dialogue, and restraint. A society that depends on force to maintain itself is not free, it is afraid. For Camus, the greatest political mistake was to believe that a perfect system could solve human problems. No system can eliminate cruelty, fear, or injustice. The best it can do is keep them within bounds. Revolution tries to erase those bounds. Camus tried to defend them. For Camus, the true alternative to violent revolution was not passivity, but rebellion grounded in human dignity. Rebellion does not aim to seize total power or to remake the world according to an abstract plan. It begins with a simple refusal. This injustice must stop. It stands in the present, not in a fantasy of the future. Camus believed that this kind of rebellion was far more difficult than revolution. Revolution offers certainty. It promises that history is on your side. It tells you who your enemies are. It gives you permission to destroy. Rebellion offers no such comfort. It demands that you fight injustice without becoming unjust. This is why Camus described rebellion as a permanent moral tension. You must resist oppression while also resisting the temptation to oppress. You must refuse cruelty without claiming moral purity. You must act without pretending that your actions are sacred. For Camus, this was the deepest form of political courage. He knew that rebellion would never produce a perfect world. It would not deliver paradise, but it could prevent hell. Revolution wants to solve history. Rebellion wants to protect people. Camus believed that once a movement decides it must control everything in order to create justice, it has already lost justice. Freedom cannot be imposed through terror. Equality cannot be enforced through execution. A humane world cannot be built by destroying human beings. This is why Camus chose limits over victory. He chose restraint over purity. He chose the fragile dignity of the present over the brutal promises of the future. In a world filled with injustice, rebellion is not a failure to dream. It is a refusal to kill for a dream. That was Camus' final answer to revolution. Do not try to build heaven by turning the earth into a graveyard.